Hello, I'm Lucy Beednell with the Arc of Northern Virginia. We are very excited to be here today with Juliet Hiznay, who's a longtime friend, ally, advocate, and special education attorney. We know that personally and professionally, we hear from families all the time who are really struggling with that new diagnosis, the first leap into setting up preschool, early intervention, the starts of special education. It's like there's an elephant in front of you that you're all of a sudden asked to eat, right? It's overwhelming and it's a whole lot. So I'm really grateful to have Juliet here to break that down into manageable chunks and to help families get through it. If you're watching this recording after the fact and have questions or needed a PDF copy of the slides, feel free to reach out anytime at thearcofnova.org. In the upper right hand corner of the website, there's a little orange and yellow box that says help. And if you put questions in there, they come to me. And we're happy to address anything that you need. Otherwise, this video will stay on YouTube as long as it's current. And we're happy to take any questions that we get live today toward the end of the presentation, and they will be anonymously shared. So without further ado, Juliet, thank you so much for being here, and please teach us all the things.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It is wonderful to be here once again with the Arc of Northern Virginia. Thank you very much for sponsoring this. I really wanted to take advantage of, the experience that I've had as an education advocate and attorney working with families who are just dealing with a new diagnosis or new to special education. And I have my own law firm practice. I serve clients across Virginia. I'm based in Northern Virginia, and I am really pleased to be here with you today to go over some of the basics of how to get services from schools and from community resources with a new diagnosis, or if you're just starting to deal with the special education process. One minor administrative note, which is that the presentation today is just for your general information. It is not legal advice, although I am an attorney. This is not intended to be legal advice, and you should consult an attorney if you need legal advice. So without further ado, I will go ahead and I will share my PowerPoint presentation here. Hopefully you all can see this. Okay, so I'm going to minimize myself. So the presentation is use your words, getting community and school supports in early childhood. And although it says early childhood, we are actually dealing with new diagnoses also. So if you're don't have a very young child, that's fine. This will still apply. Much of this will still apply to your situation. So just moving really quickly through a summary of the workshop, today we want to identify the medical and therapeutic specialists who assess and treat young children. For those who are new, that's really critical. And I know it can be really confusing because you're really drinking through a fire hose with a new diagnosis. And there's a huge learning curve. So we really rely on our parent community for a lot of that. And I know I did when I was facing this situation with a young child who seemed to need something other than what was the typical school program or the typical supports in early childhood. We're going to learn a little bit about city or county infant-toddler programs and the Child Find public school programs, just the basics. And we're going to talk about mastering magic words so that you can more effectively advocate for your child. Special ed and disability in general is an area where there's a lot of resources, a lot of public resources available, and it intersects with the therapeutic community, with the medical community, education, with obviously federal and state resources and local resources. It can be very complex to learn about all of those things. But the biggest thing that I want you to come away with the magic words piece of this really has to do with the school programs, because there's a lot of denial that goes on, meaning not that people deny that something exists, but that they don't necessarily want you to access all of the services that you might want your child to access. And so, there's a certain amount of vigilance around identifying new students who may qualify for services or children in early childhood. And so making sure that you're using the words that will trigger those evaluations is pretty important. And also making sure you're using the words so that you can effectively document any disagreement you might have with the school division is important. I also would like you to be able to communicate with confidence using commonplace terms of art and acronyms, some of the basics, and also providing you with a resource, more of a glossary for you to look at later on if you need that. We're going to talk about the breadth of eligibility categories for special education, which I know a lot of parents are surprised. There are areas that aren't necessarily obvious to everyone. And I know people, probably a lot of people think of, more obvious visible disability when they're thinking about special education and who qualifies for special education, but it's actually a very broad category and the services are also very broad. And then a brief discussion at the end on when to pursue private assessment and therapy as a supplement or alternative to public programs is something that we will be covering so that you will have an idea of when you need to go beyond what's just right in front of you in terms of the educational piece. So during this presentation, we're going to talk about what your objectives are as parents. And when I say parents, I mean parents, caregivers, anyone who's really caring for the child. And one of those, and this is, I have to admit that this is a philosophical point for me. I'm very pro inclusion, very pro independence. And so this is something that for me is basically my recommendation of what one of your parental objectives should be, which is to maximize independence at home and in the community. Why do we want that? Because we all want our children to be as independent as they can be over the course of their lifetime. And what that requires is making sure that they don't get stuck in a spot developmentally where they're not constantly in a process of learning and adapting, which, generally speaking, that's what's happening. But as parents, we can support that. So one of the ways that we can support that is working on life skills. And that is a huge range of skills, anything from helping you in the kitchen to getting their own snacks, to engaging in art projects and taking self-care, dressing themselves, bathing themselves. These are things that for some children don't come easily and really have to be taught and modeled for them, and sometimes require supplemental interventions such as speech language therapy or assistance with motor skill development through occupational or physical therapy, and also sometimes support for play skills, which can mean facilitating conversation for them, say, for example, on the playground or with peers, trying to get them to learn how to approach, initiate, and maintain play with their peers. That can include a whole range of things, of floor time play, opportunities for physical play, educational games at home. And as parents, we can support our children by providing them with some of that support. So moving along, developmental specialties for your children, which is one of the ways that we can actually promote that independence at home and in the community. And these are just sort of the general areas. It's not all inclusive. As you see at the bottom, there's other medical, but speech language therapy can be huge. And that's not just articulation, which is something that is a term that's used. It's about pronunciation of words. It's also about how we put language together, how we put words together, sentences together, paragraphs together. It facilitates and can support written language in the long run, obviously, relationships, communication, and really is a fundamental building block, not only for communicating in the community at home, but also for academics, and really is a linchpin for many students who have delays in this area. Occupational therapy, another very critical and important and common need for a lot of students with disabilities. This is more motor related, and it's anything from motor planning, which is figuring out how to get through a task, to actually using your hands and your body in order to get a task done. And it can be difficult for some students to engage in more tasks if they're not able to demonstrate those basic skills. It's not just handwriting, it's a whole host of other skills as well. Physical therapy for some students. And so for each one of these, there are professionals who are, the speech language therapists, the occupational therapists, and the physical therapists who are the medical specialists there. There's also something called a developmental pediatrician, which is a medical doctor who's a pediatrician who also has a subspecialty in development. And they are oftentimes the first person that you might see if you need to have some kind of assessment done, a basic assessment. Licensed clinical psychologists, usually not the first place that people go to with a developmental delay, but often can be very important. And because they're clinical psychologists, they can also diagnose. Licensed clinical social workers as well can oftentimes be providing services. And then there's these two areas that people often get confused, neurology and neuropsychology. And I threw them up here because it's important for you to know that neuropsychology is really the evaluation assessment part of that, and neurology is more about identifying and diagnosing brain diseases. So think of it, one is more like studying the function of how your brain functions, and the other one is more studying what's going on with your brain. So one example would be, say, a brain tumor, okay? And you can have a disability that is a physical disability of that nature that requires neurology, and for some people, they might want to rule out any kind of brain difficulties, depending on how things are presenting. But neuropsychology is the most typical um, advanced professional for diagnosing developmental disabilities when children are really young. It's kind of the gold standard. And then, of course, there's all the other medical personnel. Some really common ones include ear, nose, throat doctors. There's a host of doctors, allergy, asthma doctors, immunologists, who may play a role in some of these areas. And of course, for some people, depending on the nature of the disability or how children are presenting, you might even want to go to a geneticist. So this is a whole sub area. The one thing I really want to leave with you talking about this is that in general, you really want somebody who is a specialist who's pediatric within this specialty. Okay, that's generally the case because children may present differently than adults, and it's really important for whoever it is that you're going to have the experience with children. So another parent objective, also from my perspective, early intervention to maximum independence at school. And we're going to be talking a lot about school today, but this includes seeking supports in the form of services and accommodations. There are federal and state rights that guarantee the right to access a free, appropriate public education. And the supports can include a 504 plan, which is accommodations only. This might be gobbledygook to you, but that's a real common one, so you understand what an accommodation could be, is extended time to either turn in work, to complete classwork, to do projects, to take tests. And that's a very simple, easy one to understand. Sometimes kids need other things like headphones or large print, and there's a huge list of what that could be. And the Virginia Department of Education maintains a really good list of common accommodations available at school. The focus should be on obtaining the right supports in the right settings. So what does that mean? Well, services can be provided in the school system if you have been identified, if your student's been identified as qualifying for special education. Those services can be in a range of different arenas. They could be in a special education classroom, which is a classroom with only special ed students, or in the general education classroom, which is in the general population with all the other students. You could have someone who comes in to support a student in that general education setting, which is generally called an inclusion setting, or it's called resource support, actually. And sometimes schools will blend classrooms, so they have a mix of students who have disabilities and a mix of students who are not identified, and they may add an extra teacher. That's something called team taught, or it could be called, now it's inclusion classroom. Some people call them inclusion classroom. So that gives you kind of a little bit of an idea of when I'm saying setting, what I mean. I mean, you could be with a different mix of students. You also could get pulled out one-to-one to work with a therapist or with a teacher. And in this public school system, it's not just the classroom setting with the core content or adapted content that you might get. It's also related services such as the areas that we were just talking about: speech, language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and even vision therapy. There's a whole host of different things. There's mobility support for some people who have difficulty with mobility. For example, someone who has a vision impairment or blindness might need to learn how to navigate their environment, and they could get supports from a mobility specialist. So that gives you an idea of what's available overall. Now, moving into public programs for early childhood. So there are a number of different public programs for early childhood. And when I say public, generally speaking, that means that they are free. So you are not going to be paying anything to access these programs typically. That includes the municipal infant-toddler programs, which are tasked with identifying infants and toddlers with disabilities, or sometimes usually called the ITC. In Arlington, Virginia, it's called the PI. There's also, and so that usually looks like coming to your home in order to provide supports in your home. It's a multidisciplinary evaluation that is carried out by people who are hired by the municipality, which is going to be the county, the city, or the town. And then there's the school child find programs. This is really about identifying, they have an obligation under federal law to identify children with disabilities and to offer them services. And that child find program involves an evaluation process, and students can be referred by anyone. It can be the parent, it could be someone, an educator, to recommend evaluation for that child. And that is really the gateway to either being referred for a 504 plan, which would be just accommodations, or for an individualized education program under special education. There's also gifted services. I throw that in there because it is included in public schools typically, and they are provided with, they do provide different levels of service depending on the school division that you are in. It can be that this happens in early childhood because usually the screenings occur in early childhood. And I believe in Fairfax, for example, they tend to do a screening in second grade to identify all students and to kind of see where they are, to see whether or not they should be provided with gifted services. Why does that matter? Well, gifted services can be really critical for some students because if they're bored and at school and they're twiddling their thumbs, things can go off the rails. And we really do want to match kids' abilities with their services, and we want them to be able to explore the areas that they're capable of doing, and kind of aim a little bit higher, right? We aim a little bit higher for everybody so that we can get to them to a better place. Then there's the Medicaid waiver. This is a very, very long and complicated area for a lot of people to understand. But essentially, this is a special program for young people with disabilities. It's best to get approved for this as soon as you possibly can, or to determine if you might be a candidate for that. The ARC of Northern Virginia does a wonderful job of supporting families around the question of Medicaid waiver. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in exploring this, for you to reach out to them for some basic information. I know they've done a lot of work trying to make sure, even if you just look at their website, there's a lot of information on it. The state also maintains a lot of information. And there's two, is the CCC Plus and the DD waivers. One is, the DD is the developmental piece, and the CCC Plus, it's complicated, but basically if you have nursing level needs and you can't really function on your own, even for your age, then you may qualify under the CCC Plus. These services are not charged to parents, and it's different from Medicaid in the sense that they don't take into account family income for this service. This really is one of the gateways into adult care. So if you're looking at a situation where you think where your child may in the long run not have the opportunity to be fully independent without supports, then probably looking at the Medicaid waiver is a good idea. Then there's Medicaid FAMIS, which is basically on the medical side of supporting, and that does have an income cutoff. So just to kind of briefly give you an idea of what universe we're in. And there are other programs because there's a whole host of grant programs under federal and state. So this isn't the entire universe of public programs for early childhood, but this is the meat of it. Okay, moving on. So special education category, eligibility category. So this is, as I was saying, if you think that your child's going to need services in school, then special education is the thing that you would want to be pursuing. And there are numerous special education eligibility categories in Virginia. These oftentimes also exist. Some of these and most of these will exist at the federal level, but not every state is exactly the same in terms of the eligibility categories, and the states have some ability to kind of craft around in what they consider these different categories. So I'm just going to kind of list them off here. Developmental disability is one of the really commonplace ones for in early childhood because we're really looking at developmental delay as the as what they initially say. There's a delay. We may not necessarily know exactly what's going on here, but there's a delay in certain areas, and we've identified that. And so they don't, it's not a specific label in that sense. It's a broader category just for, and it can be useful for parents who aren't ready to slap a label on a child, or they don't have adequate information, testing hasn't come back, or developmentally it's just not clear what's going on. But you know that there's issues. It could be speech issues, communication issues, motor issues, what have you. Autism, which also includes all the prior categories that's in the DSM-5, which is the medical, Bible in terms of diagnosis. That's, there includes different levels of autism. It's called autism spectrum disorder, and there's multiple levels. In the prior DSM, which is the DSM-4, that also included related disorder, which was called Asperger's syndrome, which is no longer a term that's used in the medical community. Speech and language, other health impairment, which is a huge category. I will say as an aside that sometimes people don't want to identify or schools may not be aware of that a certain thing is a health impairment, but it actually can be. And there are some, what I would call sort of quasi-invisible impairments that may not be as readily identified as, for example, ADHD. And so sometimes schools don't really know what to do with that, but it's not a list that is closed. It's a very open list. And so they just need to, you often, behooves the parent to bring in information to the team when you're looking at other health impairment so that you can identify that this is a recognized health issue. And it can be very helpful to have some medical documentation, a letter from a medical doctor with the diagnosis, if possible, a description of the way that it impairs a student, how that would be, how that would likely impact the student in school, et cetera, and then recommended accommodations or recommendation for special ed services, if appropriate. Learning disability, this can include dyslexia, and a host of other things, but it's one of the most common ones is reading disability or math disability in math. Intellectual disability, that's a more significant cognitive disability. Used to be that people just kind of took a cutoff at 70 for the IQ. It's quite a bit more complex though. IQ has been increasingly something that people don't necessarily recognize as being static, because we can see that across tests people are performing at different levels at different times. And so I definitely would caution you about that and be really thoughtful about that. If right out of the box, someone's telling you, we think this is intellectual disability, I mean, research it, do your research and figure out what you think makes sense based on the information available. But it is a pretty significant, it's a pretty significant label to place on a child. And the only big concern about that really is whether or not people are going to appropriately challenge a child in school. emotional disability, which more is in the arena of mental health, multiple disability, which is a combination of more than one disability. Usually they start looking at that when there's 3 disabilities, and it might imply the need for a more a program that would be more geared towards a student who could, so that they could meet all of the needs of those disabling conditions in one setting. Okay, orthopedic impairment, sensory disabilities, which basically are mostly the deaf, blindness, hard of hearing, vision impairment arenas. I'm not sure if that's going to be the exclusive arena that they're looking at the state level for sensory disabilities. I think it's interesting that they're describing it that way, but those are those categories, which I think used to be actually separate categories, and now they've kind of placed them into this one grouping. And traumatic brain injury. So those are the special ed disability categories in Virginia. I just want to check in with Lucy. Do we have any questions that have come in? People can ask questions as we go along.
We don't have anything pending now, but I did want to remind folks that if you have a question, you don't have to hold on to it in your brain. You can put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it either as Juliet checks in or as we get to the end, because we know sometimes you hear something and it prompts something to mind right away. So feel free to get it out there on virtual paper.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, another parent objective is to communicate as an equal member of the education team. So what does that mean? Well, you go into one of these meetings, even if it's a 504 plan meeting, it can be a big group of people, but if it's an eligibility meeting with members of the public school, with staff of the public school, you could have as many as 10 specialists in the room. Typically, the basics, the bare bones of what is required for this typically is that they usually, for eligibility, have a social worker, they have a school psychologist, they have a special educator, a general educator, and an administrator. But you could end up having a whole bunch of other people. You could have reading specialists, occupational therapists, speech language therapists, physical therapists. It's a long list of who could show up. And so oftentimes parents go into these kinds of meetings not realizing how formal the process is and not being really prepared to ask questions, or feeling like they're not in a position to ask questions, and sometimes coming away very confused or not being able to remember what was said during a meeting. I would definitely encourage you to go with another person if you can, because it can be a very emotional and fraught process to go through the eligibility process, or even developing a 504 plan or an individualized education plan for your child can be really hard. And so, I want you to be able to go in understanding at least some of the basics of the acronyms and the terms of art. And also, highly recommend that you stop them and ask. I don't care if it's the middle of the meeting. If there's something they're saying that you don't understand, then you always should be, and you are within your rights as a full member of the team, and you have the right to participate. You are a required member of that team for special ed meetings. Ask them, what you keep using this term, or what is this term? What does it mean? What does it stand for? Please try to avoid the acronyms and tell me what they are so I understand what you're talking about, because they are all in these meetings constantly, every single week. Special educators, general educators, and administrators are in these meetings. And it's not that they're trying to confuse you. It's just that they're used to using these acronyms, and it's hard for them to not use it. It's a shorthand for them. And they're all understanding it, maybe except for the parents. And so it's super important to ask the question, to stop and ask the question. It's okay to slow down that process. It's okay to take as much time as you need, because you're making big decisions and it's important. All right, so I talked about magic words. So this is all part of trying to make sure that you can exercise your rights in a way that's actually going to lead to getting services in place for your child. So this is mostly focused on special ed in particular, right? So if you believe that your child needs to be evaluated for possible special education services, and if you just send off an email and you say, oh, I'm worried about my child. What do you think? Do you think that my child should be, evaluated for any additional support? That language may not actually trigger a referral for special education evaluation, unfortunately. And I see it all the time in my practice where parents are coming to me. It's actually an active issue in my practice right now. Parents coming to me and they've been denied and denied over time. And it seems like they just haven't quite gotten over the hump of triggering that legal requirement in writing. And this is all in writing, right? We want to be able to prove and show that we've made these requests and when we have made them. Why? Because there are deadlines that school divisions are required to meet, and they have some legal obligations they're required to meet. And so if you use your magic words, then it has a tendency to open doors. So one of these, and again, this is not legal advice, this is for your general information, but one of these is to say, we suspect a disability and request special education evaluation to determine if special education services are required. Oh, there's a typo, sorry. So our child can access the general education curriculum. This is because this is the language that is the legal standard for saying, hey, the child needs to be evaluated and I want to go straight to special ed evaluation. I don't want to go to some side student team that's going to do, have a nice little discussion about what Johnny needs. No, I want Johnny to be formally evaluated. And that's the language we want to be using to get there. You may also want to specify the evaluations, and a comprehensive evaluation is definitely going to include a psychological evaluation, an educational evaluation, maybe usually a sociocultural, sometimes speech language, sometimes occupational therapy. If you don't agree with the findings of the student study committee or the eligibility committee, then you should put in writing that you dissent from the findings. The team should provide you with an opportunity to dissent, but they don't always inform you of the opportunity to dissent. And so, if you've got a piece of paperwork there and it doesn't actually have a place to say, okay, I dissent, and if they don't give you time to submit something, you can later on submit that form, handwrite on it. What I would tell you not to do is to sign that you're in agreement with the findings, because it's two different things. You could say, I'm signing to say I was present versus I'm signing an agreement. I'm in agreement with the committee. And even if the entire school team says we're in agreement, that's the time when you have to say, well, we're not in agreement. And don't be afraid to say that. If you're not in agreement, you're not in agreement. And since you went to the trouble of going through this process, my best guess is it's most likely that you're not in agreement. And you should take your time to let them know that and to identify the reasons why. Sometimes they issue these very formalized forms. They're called prior written notices. And they describe, this is in Virginia, they do it after the fact, after the meeting, typically. That's not true everywhere. You can say, we disagree with the description of the meeting. If you feel like they've left something out, they haven't documented it, there are inaccuracies in that document, I would encourage you to challenge those, because that's not okay for them to be doing that. They need to, anything that was a critical part of that conversation should be identified. They can say in that, we disagreed with what the parent said, but they should, if you asked for something and they denied it and it is not listed in that document, that's a problem. It really needs to be there. We disagree with the evaluations. That would be the content of the evaluations, and request an independent education evaluation at public expense in the following areas. This is if you want to move on to the next step and getting an IEE done. Now, this is tricky in terms of when it's available and when it isn't available, but once you've qualified for special education and there are evaluations and there's an IEE request, you should be able to access that every 12 months from the time of an evaluation being done. And now, if it's the initial one, you may actually have to go to due process in order to request a review of what they've done. But generally speaking, once you have a student who's been identified, if there's an evaluation you don't agree with it, you can request an independent education evaluation. I'll give you an example that's really common, which is in the areas of related services, especially speech language and occupational therapy. The school division may deny you access to those. They may just say, we're not going to evaluate in those areas. We have no reason to think there's any issue, so we're refusing. And this can happen even if you've got private speech language in place, you've got private occupational therapy in place, and they're still saying, no, your student doesn't need anything, your student is fine, your student has accommodations and your child is fine and we don't need to do anything. Well, in that case, you're in disagreement with them, right? And remember, we're looking for independence at school, independence at home, independence in the community as your long-term objective. And so not getting those services in place in school in that setting where they can really take advantage and develop those skills can be damaging over the long run. And a lot of the issues I run into with clients is, students over long run haven't been given those related services when they really needed them, or they needed more of them. They needed more of it in a more intensive setting, such as one-to-one or in small group pullout. So, that's an area that is something that falls under special education law, is this right to an independent education evaluation at public expense. It's a complex area, but it is one of those common areas of disagreement, and you can access that, making those requests. Again, recommend that you make them in writing. And then if there's a proposed setting that you don't like, we disagree with the proposed setting, and then you would say, because it's not the least restrictive setting. So that's a term of art. Least restrictive setting is the term of art, and it has to do with the level of supports, access to typically developing peers or not, and sometimes even not being in a regular school building or a regular schools program. And so there can be, the entire special ed law is geared toward making sure the student is educated in the least restrictive setting and included as much as possible. That's the law. And if they're not doing that, and they should be, you're going to want to actually document that. Now, some parents want more support, and so you would want to be documenting that as well, if that's the case. So these are some of the most common phrases that you might want to be going to, using your magic words to try to get to a place where you documented your need for something or your disagreement with what the school division has done. Here are some sample acronyms. I know I said we were going to go over some acronyms, and some of you may be familiar with these or you may not. I also have here the link for the Virginia Department of Education Glossary of Education Terms, which is actually a great public resource. But here it is, ITC. These are things that you might come across a lot in these meetings or in emails with staff at school. Infant-toddler connection, ITC. Parent-infant education program, PI. The IFSP, Individual and Family Support Program. An IEP is an individualized education program, that's special ed. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's the major special education law in the United States. 504 means Section 5, that says Section 5, 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. LRE, least restrictive environment. FAPE, free appropriate public education. 2E, which is twice exceptional, student who's disabled and gifted at the same time. The DD waiver, the developmental disability Medicaid waiver, the CCC plus waiver, Commonwealth Coordinated Care plus Medicaid waiver. And so those are some of the most common. There's tons of acronyms, but this is one of the most common. These are some of the most common ones that you might run across. So I know we're trying to get through this as best we can so that we can have some time to talk about all of this and answer your questions. So parent objective, this is the last one we're going to go over, which is knowing when to get outside help. So one time when it's really important for you to get outside help is when you feel like you're running into a brick wall, you're not getting answers that you need through the school evaluations, you're confused, or you think you're missing something. You get some outside help to clarify, because there's something that's really important and fundamental about all of this process, which is to understand that when you're at that moment where you can't make a decision and you're not sure what to do and you don't know what the right answer is, the thing that can most often help you beyond any other is to get more information so that you're more fully informed. And usually, when you're talking about developmental disability, you're talking about young children. That means evaluation. Okay. And we go back to the whole front of the beginning of this, which is a discussion about the medical specialties and the therapy specialties. All of those groups of people and not everyone does the evaluations, but they all have the training and should have the competency to conduct those evaluations and assessments and come up with, diagnoses and recommendations. Now, I will say the recommendations that they make, you have to remember the filter. If you're going to a therapist or medical professional, it's outside of the school system. That is not a school filter. It's not an education filter. And so just remember that, if doctors and educators really should stay within their orbit, they should stay within the orbit of what they really know and what they're professional in. And if they go beyond their orbit, then it's important to recognize that they've done so, because they shouldn't, right? Educators shouldn't be diagnosing, and doctors shouldn't be saying, okay, in the education setting, this student is going to require this specific thing, if they don't really have any context for saying so and they don't have the training to say so. It won't be well received, put it that way. Educators often do not like to be told by medical doctors what school services a student requires. That being said, when medical professionals can describe the barriers that the student is facing, that child is facing, by describing it in terms of a diagnosis and symptomology, that can be very powerful. And the more detailed, the better. Not every clinician is going to have, the interest or be really great at writing letters. But if you find one who's really great at that, hang on to them, because they can be really, really helpful in presenting information to school teams. So, you might want to look at some kind of medical evaluation in neuropsychology. There are other things that can happen and can affect cognition and communication. They're actually medical conditions. So I'll give you an example. Severe allergies, okay? You could have a chronic sinusitis that's impacting your child's hearing. It's causing things that you're not really aware of, and maybe they're too young to describe to you, or not developmentally of an age to be able to describe it to you, such as chronic headaches, right? And so if you take care of medical issues that could be a barrier to I don't know, conforming their behavior to the standards that are expected. If a student is in pain, they're not going to be ready to learn. So there's some basic things like that. Another arena that usually presents a little bit later could be trauma related issues that could come up and present themselves in the school setting. And until some of those issues are being addressed, the student really may have difficulty being successful engaging with their work at school. So, ruling out certain types of things is super important. Ruling out medical causes. So for example, for pain, before you would accept, this is just an example, a finding of a cognitive disability. Language barriers can also be a very big issue that could impact IQ, because tests tend to be geared towards language-based testing. And you could have a situation where the student might not have the building blocks for the language, or the ability to express effectively, or the motor skills to be able to engage the test effectively. All of those are really important to make sure that you're not getting a skewed data set on your testing. So that is the end of that portion of the presentation. Obviously this presentation will be available through the ARC, and this is just a description of my firm and the services that I provide, but I'm ready to take any questions that you may have.
All right. I'll let people keep typing them in. But Juliet, as you were speaking, I thought about questions that we get often from families and thought I know sometimes folks are shy about sharing. As a reminder, we'll read your question anonymously. But I know that these are things that are on parents' minds a lot. And one that we get often is, well, if I just want my child to be in a segregated setting, just kids with disabilities in preschool or kindergarten or first grade, can I get back to inclusion later? Can I just flip it at another point in time? And what is your experience with this?
Well, we have to look at service hours. Okay. So let's suppose that you are in a school division that provides full-time pre-K for students with disabilities. This is kind of unusual, but it could exist. Okay. And they've prepared an IEP, an individualized education plan that is 30 hours a week. That's basically full time. Okay. Let's just say 30 hours is full time. That's You're in the special education setting the entire time that you're at school and you're in no other setting. Um, you may find yourself in a situation where you have agreed to such an IEP and the team thinks that it's still the appropriate IEP and you do not think it's still the appropriate IEP. And I have been in the position of having to work with families through that. And sometimes it can take years, even with my help. Sometimes it has taken a year, 2 years to get staff to start being willing to attempt those inclusion settings. And so it is a serious decision. I guess what I would say is when you go into your preschool setting, you really should be looking at the service hours partly as an experiment. And I know that sounds, maybe that's a bad word, but you should be thinking of it as I need data points from inclusion settings and from the special education setting. I need both data sets. Why? Because you need to understand if there's actually a benefit to being in that more restrictive setting. And so when I've been facing this type of situation, working with my clients, I usually will encourage them if the staff is not budging, if the school will not budge on the service hours and you can't come to agreement with it, you really need to think about doing a partial consent IEP, number one, which you may find is a lot easier to navigate if you hire someone like me. Doing it on your own could be really hard. But a partial consent IEP could be an answer, which basically would say, we agree to XYZ portion of the IEP, but we do not agree to the placement and the service hours that are being provided. And then you describe that. Now, that doesn't mean that you get to change it because you can't unilaterally change that. You have to think of IEPs as being contracts. They're basically contracts. You've said, okay, I agree with this. And if you can't get to yes on an amendment or in your annual IEP the next year around, then your situation is basically that you're kind of at what they call a stay put IEP, which is you're sticking with what you have because you can't agree to anything. That can lead to problems with having stale services. It can lead to problems with having stale accommodations. And you really don't want to be in that situation. And so the partial consent IEP can be one answer, but working with families, I also encourage them to make sure their children have some exposure to inclusion settings, even if it's outside of the school context, and then documenting what that looks like. And that can help ease the mind sometimes of staff members if they start getting these types of feedback from the community saying, hey, this student's actually doing okay and is being successful in this other more inclusive setting. You should, and they usually are not going to make a recommendation in the school setting, but, parents can go in with that and say, hey, look, we understand that you're concerned about X, Y, and Z, but this is our experience in other settings. And now there's always the argument, well, that's not the same, this, that, and the other. But if it's a structured setting that has, interventions or has playtime, it has circle time, it has, some kind of, activity task time that requires a certain level of attention and collaboration with other people, it's going to be hard for them to argue that that's not an important data point. And so you can always bring in those data points. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is if you are going to go into a preschool setting, I would not start off with full-time special ed in that setting unless it was really obvious that the student needed that intensity of service.
All right. Another one I bet you hear a lot, and this is maybe my most commonly asked special ed question. What's the best school for this? Should I just move to be somewhere? Questions like, what's the best school for someone with Down syndrome? Someone with
Mm,
autism? What's that objective best school? Your thoughts on
yeah.
how to help families navigate that?
Well, I like to say there is no perfect placement and there is no perfect IEP. Okay. So let's just start there. But, basically, schools are going to be very similar in general at the level that you're at. So the continuum of services for IEPs is actually quite broad. We didn't talk about this during the presentation, but really it's, anything from a regular school setting in the general education setting, regular classroom, to residential or clinical placement. And in between, you have these special education settings, and you have something called private day school, which are separate schools that are just for special ed students that are privately run. So, and licensed by the state, typically licensed by the state. There are some privates out there, but usually they're licensed by the state. And, you know, sometimes people get a diagnosis and they're like, well, I want to go to the private school. But the thing about that is, until you have an understanding of how your child is going to respond in a more inclusive setting with general education students, so that you're seeing some modeling and you've got some opportunities to access a regular school program, you may not really know whether or not they require that super restrictive setting. And usually school teams are not willing to go there right out of the bat. Typically, the offer is going to be to place the student in the regular school program and see how it goes. I have a personal opinion about what's the best school, and that personal opinion is the place that's going to be the kindest, most welcoming place to your child. Okay. The place that's going to provide your child with adequate challenges and is going to be accepting of your child, is going to promote their social emotional well-being and their social engagement with other people. And that environment, when you walk into a school, you can feel that environment usually when you walk into a school. And even if it's just how the staff respond to situations or their body language or expressions, that environment of having a welcoming environment, that's the best place for students as a general matter. And that's not just for special ed students, that's for everybody.
We have a number of families, especially new to this world, who will come back to us and say, something's really working for us at home in
Mhm.
private therapy. We've seen something or we have this idea and we presented it to the school and they said, we never do that. That's not an option. That can't be done. And
Mhm.
I feel like parents are stuck there. Is that really true? How do I figure this out? And why can't it be done?
I mean, I think that this is where reaching out to either an advocate or the parent community or both can be really helpful, because being quite honest with you, there's a lot of um, knee-jerk rigidity oftentimes in public schools. They have their programs, they have their training, they have their system that they've set up, and they have reasons for that, right? The reasons they have are logistical oftentimes, right? They have a certain number of students, they have a certain number of staff, and they have a certain number of people with different kinds of training, and they're highly regulated. And so, at that point, is that something that's realistic to do in school? It really depends on the question. It really depends on what you're asking for. But, I've seen it be a denial for anything from lunch bunches, right? To individualized therapy, to, I don't know, best buddy programs, or There's something about benches. I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's like the buddy bench or something where we put the buddy bench up and you can go sit there. And but as a general matter, I have found that there can be some rigidity to supporting social emotional needs and play-based types of supports, particularly in those unstructured settings. Because why? Well, they've got the classroom setting, they've got their supports in there, they've got their people in there, their personnel in there. Out on the playground, at lunchtime, in the hallways, it's harder for them to provide supports also because people need their break time and they need to take their lunch and they need to get to the bathroom. And so there's like I say, I think a lot of this is logistical for schools. But if you feel it's super important to the well-being of your child, you should push back. I mean, I ask for clients to be, I ask school divisions to consider support on the playground all the time because it can be a very vulnerable place for students with disabilities, and it's also a great opportunity to be able to support them in their social emotional well-being, in their communication skills, in their motor skills, whatever it is. You can support students in that less structured setting. It's about making it work and figuring out a way of going about it that can be successful.
Right. I'm going to try and squeeze in one other one that we get often. And
Yeah.
that is my child going to be hurt or limited in applying for programs or going to college by their IEP label? If we should we push for an other health impairment label as opposed to an ID label? Should we do DD as opposed to autism? Those kinds of things. Is there a strategic need to change that label or push?
I mean, I will tell you that getting into college and doing post-secondary, there is a lot of strategy that goes into that. It's a very broad question. Um, I think that it very much depends on the circumstances for your child, and you're always looking to balance the needs of the child with, the long-term objectives of what you want to do. But there are a lot of people whose kids have been in mostly in inclusion environments and maybe with a team taught setting for some of their classes who actually do end up stepping down from an IEP to a 504 plan at the end of their high school career or at the end of their middle school career, whenever that is. Um, and, it kind of reduces some of that concern. Some classes are going to be special education classes. Colleges are going to know that they're special education classes, but if they're credit bearing classes, it's not always obvious. And the co-taught setting isn't listed on your transcript, right? So I do think that, a lot of this stuff, first of all, is confidential. The schools are not going to be reporting disability status to colleges, but some of those formal records may actually end up, you know, there, or you might have a requirement to report, for example, disciplinary records, which, trying to avoid a disciplinary record in high school is pretty important if you're wanting your student to be college bound. But as a general matter, there are privacy rights in place in the public school system under the Family Education Privacy Rights Act. And so you do have some legal protections available. If you're going to self-report some of these things, like if you're going to write an essay, a college essay that's about overcoming, barriers due to disability, as a personal statement about your own life, obviously, then you're sharing that information already. But, in terms of what the record keeping looks like moving into schools, the classes alone, as long as they're credit bearing, wouldn't necessarily signal that unless it was a special ed class. That they'll have an idea if it says strategies for success. This is not, it may or may not be a special ed class, but they know that that's not, you know, uh, an intense academic course or a regular elective in the sense of, this is what every student is going to be taking because, it's something that really provides a supplement. It's more of a support than anything else.
Okay, I will let us in so we can be respectful of everyone's time. I wanted to thank you so much for your help. Again, we can't emphasize enough how much we know and feel this is a really scary time to be a parent, getting that new diagnosis, trying to make sure you get this right. It's your kiddo and you feel like the world's on your shoulders and you have to do it all perfectly. I feel like I always learn when we hear from you and that you're always so great about sharing resources. So
Thank
we'll
you
get
so
a
much.
PDF version of these slides and a copy of the link out to folks who registered. And again, questions are always welcome. Thank you so much for your time, Juliet.
Thank you so much for hosting. Appreciate you. Thank you everyone for coming.